They thought the bill was airtight, untouchable, already sold to the public as common sense. Then Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth, and in a matter of seconds, the entire argument started to collapse. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision. One sentence exposed the contradiction, another revealed who the bill actually hurts. And suddenly, Greg Abbott's talking points sounded rehearsed, fragile, and empty. You can feel the shift in the room when facts hit harder than fear, when logic cuts through political noise, and when someone refuses to let power hide behind vague language. This wasn't a long debate or a drawn-out exchange, it was a moment. The kind of moment where silence speaks louder than applause, and an argument that took months to craft falls apart in real time. Watch closely how clarity dismantles confusion, how accountability replaces spin, and how one voice can change the entire direction of a conversation in seconds. The claim at the center of Greg Abbott's bill was presented as if it was self-evident, almost beyond challenge, wrapped in language that sounded protective, responsible, and reasonable on the surface. It leaned heavily on the idea that the bill was about safety, order, and fairness, using broad terms that made opposition seem reckless or emotional. Supporters framed it as a necessary response to a manufactured crisis, repeating phrases designed to trigger urgency rather than invite scrutiny. The wording avoided specifics, choosing instead to rely on general fears and assumptions that had already been planted in public discourse. By doing this, the claim positioned itself as common sense, implying that anyone who questioned it must be ignoring reality or defending chaos. This rhetorical strategy made the argument appear strong because it didn't initially invite debate. It dared people to object without first unpacking what was actually being proposed. At its core, the claim relied on a simplified cause and effect narrative that didn't hold up under closer examination. It suggested that a single legislative action could neatly solve a complex social issue, glossing over the legal, constitutional, and human consequences involved. The bill's defenders leaned on selective examples and anecdotal references rather than comprehensive data, creating an illusion of evidence without providing full context. The language blurred the line between enforcement and punishment, between regulation and overreach, making it difficult for casual listeners to immediately spot where the logic broke down. This ambiguity worked in the bill's favor, because vague claims are harder to attack unless someone is willing to slow the conversation down and ask uncomfortable questions. What made the claim especially vulnerable was its dependence on assumed agreement. It presumed that everyone shared the same definition of safety, legality, and responsibility, without acknowledging that these terms can mean very different things depending on who is affected by the policy. The argument didn't account for how the bill would be implemented in real life, or who would bear the brunt of its enforcement. By avoiding those details, the claim stayed comfortably theoretical, where it could not easily be disputed. It sounded firm because it existed more as a talking point than a fully reasoned position, designed to survive soundbites rather than serious examination. Another weakness lay in how the claim selectively framed authority. It leaned on the power of the state as an unquestioned good, assuming that government action is inherently justified as long as it claims to protect the public. The bill's argument didn't grapple with constitutional limits or precedent in a meaningful way, instead treating legality as something flexible when politically convenient. This allowed supporters to project confidence without addressing whether the policy could withstand legal scrutiny. The strength of the claim was performative, rooted in confidence and repetition rather than rigorous reasoning. The bill's supporters also relied on emotional contrast, presenting the issue as a choice between action and inaction, strength and weakness. By doing so, they avoided engaging with alternative solutions or critiques that fell outside this narrow frame. The claim suggested that rejecting the bill meant endorsing disorder, a false dilemma that shut down nuanced discussion. This tactic worked well in speeches and interviews, where there was little time to unpack assumptions, and where assertiveness often passes for accuracy. Yet beneath the polished language and confident delivery, the claim lacked internal consistency. Certain justifications contradicted each other when placed side by side, revealing that the argument had been assembled from talking points rather than a coherent framework. It tried to appeal simultaneously to legal authority, moral urgency, and practical effectiveness, without fully satisfying any of those standards. Once someone began to examine how these justifications interacted, the cracks became visible. The argument's apparent strength depended entirely on no one pausing, long enough to question how its parts fit together, or whether the promised outcomes aligned with the methods proposed. The contrast between facts and fear was where the argument truly fell apart. Because fear depends on speed while facts demand a pause. Fear-based political messaging works best when it keeps people from asking follow-up questions, when it frames urgency as a reason to stop thinking rather than start analyzing. In this moment, the narrative supporting the bill relied on exaggerated threats and worst-case scenarios, presented as if they were inevitable outcomes rather than speculative possibilities. These claims were repeated so often that they began to sound like truths, even though they were built on assumptions instead of verified evidence. Once facts entered the conversation, the emotional momentum that fear had created began to slow. Facts have a way of grounding abstract arguments in reality, and that grounding is dangerous for policies built on exaggeration. When data, legal context, and real-world implications were brought into focus, the sweeping claims behind the bill suddenly seemed overstated and imprecise. Fear had painted the issue in black and white, but facts introduced nuance, and nuance disrupted the simplicity that made the messaging effective. The more the conversation shifted toward what could be proven, the harder it became to sustain. The narrative of imminent danger that justified extreme measures. Lived impact played a critical role in dismantling the messaging, because it forced the argument to confront people instead of concepts. Fear-based rhetoric often talks about groups, in the abstract, reducing human beings to statistics or stereotypes. By emphasizing how the bill would affect real individuals in tangible ways, the argument lost its emotional shield. The imagined threat no longer outweighed the visible harm. When policy outcomes are tied to actual lives, fear loses its moral high ground, because it becomes harder to justify collateral damage as necessary or unavoidable. Another weakness of fear-driven messaging is its reliance on repetition rather than explanation. The same phrases are used again and again, not to clarify, but to condition audiences into acceptance. Facts interrupt that conditioning by demanding specificity. They ask how, why, and under what authority. Once those questions are raised, repetition becomes insufficient. In this case, the messaging could not survive sustained scrutiny, because it had never been designed to. It was meant to persuade quickly, not withstand detailed examination. The exposure of this tactic also changed how the audience interpreted the bill's defenders. What once sounded confident began to sound rehearsed. What once felt urgent began to feel manipulative. When fear is challenged successfully, it doesn't just weaken an argument, it changes how listeners perceive the people making it. The shift is subtle but powerful. Authority starts to look like insecurity, and certainty begins to resemble avoidance. Facts don't need to raise their voice to achieve this effect. Their strength lies in consistency and verifiability. By grounding the discussion in reality, the conversation moved away from imagined chaos and toward measurable outcomes. This forced a comparison between what was promised and what could realistically be delivered. Fear thrives in uncertainty, but facts reduce uncertainty by setting boundaries around what is possible and what is not. As those boundaries became clearer, the extreme claims used to justify the bill no longer fit within them. The emotional appeal lost coherence when placed alongside evidence that told a different story. This moment also highlighted how fear-based messaging often ignores unintended consequences. By focusing narrowly on a perceived threat, it avoids accounting for the broader ripple effects of policy decisions. Facts bring those consequences into view, making it harder to pretend they don't exist. Once acknowledged, these effects complicate the narrative of simple solutions and force a more honest reckoning with trade-offs. That reckoning is precisely what fear-driven arguments are designed to avoid. In the end, the dismantling didn't happen through confrontation, but through exposure. The fear was not shouted down, it was outgrown. Facts and lived impact reframed the issue in a way that made exaggeration unnecessary and distortion obvious. The message that once relied on emotional urgency could no longer stand on its own, because it had been asked to prove itself against reality rather than imagination. What made this moment resonate beyond the immediate exchange was how quickly it escaped the confines of the room and entered public consciousness. It wasn't just another political back and forth, it was a clear example of how a well-framed challenge can puncture a dominant narrative in real time. Viewers didn't need deep policy knowledge to understand what had happened. They could see confidence give way to hesitation and clarity replace repetition. That visual and emotional clarity made the moment shareable, because it translated complex policy debate into something universally recognizable. An argument exposed by its own contradictions. Public perception shifted because the exchange disrupted expectations. Many people had been conditioned to believe that certain political figures and policies were beyond meaningful challenge, protected by authority, repetition, and media framing. When that protection failed in such a visible way, it altered how audiences evaluated similar claims going forward. The moment didn't just undermine a single argument, it introduced doubt into a broader narrative. Once doubt takes hold, audiences become more attentive, more skeptical, and more willing to question what they are told. Another reason the impact traveled so far was the speed of the collapse. Long debates can blur responsibility and allow audiences to disengage, but a rapid unraveling is unmistakable. The fact that the shift happened in seconds made it harder to dismiss as misinterpretation or partisan spin. The simplicity of the exchange became its strength. There was no need for editing or extended explanation. The contradiction spoke for itself. That immediacy is what allowed the moment to circulate widely and resonate across different platforms. And political perspectives thought the exchange also redefined what strength looked like in political discourse. Traditionally, strength is associated with volume, dominance, and certainty. This moment suggested something different. That strength can come from restraint, precision, and preparedness. Viewers saw that power does not always belong to the person speaking the longest or loudest, but to the one who understands the issue deeply enough to ask the right question. That reframing influenced how audiences assessed future debates, shifting attention away from performance and toward substance. Media amplification played a role, but it wasn't the primary driver of the shift. The content itself carried the weight. Clips were shared not because of dramatic flair, but because they captured a truth that felt rare in political coverage: accountability in action. Audiences recognized the authenticity of the exchange, and that recognition fostered trust. When people feel they are witnessing something genuine, they are more likely to internalize its implications rather than dismiss it as spectacle. The moment also empowered viewers who felt disconnected from policy debates by demonstrating how complex arguments can be challenged through clear thinking rather than expertise alone. It lowered the barrier to engagement. People could imagine themselves asking similar questions in their own communities, workplaces, or conversations. That sense of accessibility transformed the exchange from a passive viewing experience into a participatory one, where audiences felt invited to think critically rather than simply choose sides. As the clips circulated, it became a reference point. Future discussions about the bill, and even about similar policies, were inevitably compared back to that moment. The narrative had changed from unquestioned authority to contested logic. Once a moment achieves that status, it continues to influence perception long after the original exchange fades from headlines. It becomes shorthand for a larger lesson about power, scrutiny, and the value of clarity. Ultimately, the lasting shift in perception came from how the moment aligned with a growing public appetite for transparency. Many viewers are tired of slogans that substitute for explanation and fear that replaces facts. This exchange validated that frustration by showing what happens when those tactics are confronted directly. It reminded audiences that arguments can be tested, that authority can be questioned, and that even well-established narratives can unravel when exposed to careful, deliberate scrutiny.